The scent of garlic and basil was a shield. Here, in the gleaming, sterile kitchen of Kenshin Tanaka's Tokyo mansion, Naomi could pretend she was somewhere else. Anywhere else. The heat from the 6-burner gas stove was a familiar comfort, the rhythmic chop of her knife a meditation. She moved with an economy of motion born from years of working in kitchens far less grand than this one, a fluid dance between cutting board and sizzling pan. Tonight's dinner was a rich bolognese over fresh pappardelle, a dish requested 2 days ago and then promptly forgotten. Mr. Tanaka was not expected home. A text from his severe, silent assistant had confirmed it an hour ago. The master will be dining out. An indefinite engagement. Indefinite. In this world, that word tasted like blood and iron. Naomi had learned not to ask questions. She was 18, alone in a city that barely knew she existed, and this job was the only thing keeping a roof over her head. A very large, very empty roof. So she cooked the meal as ordered, her hands moving with the certainty of a professional. The sauce simmered, deep and fragrant. The pasta water rolled to a boil. She worked for a ghost, a presence felt only in the perfect, untouched state of the house and the crisp yen that appeared in her bank account every Friday. When the meal was finished, plated on a single piece of black ceramic that probably cost more than her last month's rent, it sat on the steel pass-through, a perfect sculpture of food no one would eat. The waste was a physical ache in her stomach. Back home, a meal like this would have been a celebration. Here, it was an afterthought. The silence of the house pressed in. It was a heavy, weighted silence, unlike the quiet of an empty home. It was the quiet of a place that held secrets, of rooms that had witnessed things she was better off not imagining. Her own small room off the kitchen was a monk's cell, her only sanctuary. But tonight, the hunger gnawing at her was sharper than her discipline. She made a decision. It was a small rebellion. She took a clean, modest bowl from a lower cabinet, not the fine china. She served herself a small portion of the spaghetti, the sauce clinging to the thick noodles. Her heart beat a little faster, a frantic bird against her ribs. It was leftovers. Technically, it was destined for the bin. But it felt like stealing. She didn't dare sit at the massive dining table that could seat 20, or even at the small breakfast nook overlooking the Zen garden. Instead, she carried her bowl into the walk-in pantry, the coolest, most private corner of her domain. She slid down the wall, her white chef's jacket crinkling, and sat on the cool, polished concrete floor. Tucking her legs to the side, she balanced the bowl on her lap and lifted the first forkful to her lips. The flavor was explosive. Rich tomato, savory beef, a hint of wine and herbs. It was good. She had made it, but tasting it here, in this stolen moment, made it feel like a luxury. She closed her eyes, just for a second, letting the warmth spread through her. That was when she made the mistake of looking up. A shadow fell over her. It wasn't the flicker of an automatic light. It was solid, human-shaped, and utterly still. Her fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her breath caught in her throat. Kenshin Tanaka stood in the pantry doorway. He was not supposed to be here. He was a myth, a whisper, a signature on a contract. Naomi had only seen him twice in the 3 months she'd worked for him, both times from a distance, a glimpse of a flawlessly tailored suit disappearing into a black car. Now, he was real. He filled the doorway, not with bulk, but with an absolute density of presence. He wore a charcoal wool suit, the kind that cost more than a car, tailored with such precision it looked like a second skin. His white shirt was pristine, the top button undone. At his collar, the black ink of a tattoo peeked out, the claw of a dragon, its scales intricate and menacing. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe late 20s, his face carved from sharp angles and cold indifference. His black hair was cut short, severe. A thin, white scar sliced through his left eyebrow, the only mar on an otherwise perfect, cruel face. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, almost black, and utterly devoid of emotion. They took in the scene without surprise, without anger. They simply observed. The girl on the floor, the bowl of stolen food, the fork trembling in her hand. The silence stretched, thin and sharp. In that quiet, Naomi's mind raced through the consequences. She would be fired, thrown out tonight with nowhere to go. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks. She was caught like a child with her hand in the cookie jar, and the man who owned the jar was the rumored head of the Shinjuku Yakuza. She should stand, apologize, plead. But her limbs were frozen, locked in place by the sheer predatory stillness of his gaze. He took a step into the pantry. The air grew colder. He smelled of cedar and smoke, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the homey aroma of the bolognese. He stopped a few feet from her, looking down. His expression did not change. "Is it good?" he asked. His voice was low, a gravelly whisper that seemed to scrape against the silence. It was not the question she expected. It was not an accusation. It was a simple, genuine inquiry. Naomi could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He watched her for another long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, he did something that shattered her understanding of the world. He crouched down. Not all the way, but he bent his knees, bringing his face closer to her level, a deliberate and shocking breach of the chasm between them. His expensive suit creased. He was close enough now that she could see the fine weave of the fabric, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. "My meeting concluded early," he said, his voice still quiet, intimate in the small space. The words were neutral, but the implication was not. Meetings like his did not simply conclude, they ended in someone else's loss. He glanced at her bowl, then back at her face. "You are the cook, Naomi." He said her name differently than anyone else had. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of ownership. He knew who she was. The thought was both terrifying and strangely validating. She was not invisible to him. "Yes, sir," she managed to whisper, the words scratching her throat. "You eat on the floor," he observed, his tone flat. Shame washed over her again, hot and sharp. She started to stammer an explanation, an apology, but he held up a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that silenced her instantly. His hands were beautiful and lethal. Long, elegant fingers, clean nails. More ink coiled around his right wrist, disappearing under the cuff of his shirt. "From tomorrow," he said, and the finality in his voice was absolute, "you will prepare 2 plates. You will eat at the table. With me." He stood then, the motion fluid and silent. He looked down at her one last time, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he turned and walked away, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the concrete floor. Naomi sat there, her heart hammering against her ribs, the forgotten bowl of spaghetti growing cold in her lap. She wasn't fired. She was invited, commanded. She had been hiding in the shadows of his house, a ghost in her own right, and he had just dragged her into the light. The pantry, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage she had just been released from, only to be led into a much larger, more dangerous one. That was the moment everything changed. She was no longer just the cook. She was his. The first dinner was the longest hour of Naomi's life. She sat at one end of the 10-foot black marble table, Kenshin at the other. The distance felt both immense and insufficient. She had prepared a simple grilled sea bass with asparagus and lemon, her hands shaking so badly she'd almost dropped the plate. She wore her clean white chef's jacket, feeling exposed and out of place in the cavernous, silent dining room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a rain-slicked Tokyo. Kenshin ate with a focused, deliberate grace. He used chopsticks for everything, his movements precise and economical. He didn't speak. He simply ate, his dark eyes occasionally lifting to watch her across the vast expanse of polished stone. Naomi felt like a specimen, under a microscope. She tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Every scrape of her fork against the plate seemed to echo, like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. This became their ritual. Every night, she would cook. Every night, they would sit at opposite ends of the table and eat in silence. She learned about him in fragments. He preferred savory over sweet. He disliked anything overly complicated. He drank only water with his meals. And he watched her. Always, he watched her, his gaze intense and analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. She began to notice things about him, too. The way his shoulders were always tense, even when he seemed relaxed. The way the scar over his eye would tighten when his phone buzzed with a message he didn't like. She saw the exhaustion that sometimes settled deep in his eyes, a weariness that his perfect posture and expensive suits couldn't quite conceal. One evening, about 2 weeks into their silent routine, a delivery arrived. It wasn't food or supplies. A man in a dark suit, someone Naomi had never seen before, brought a small, lacquered wooden box to the door. He handed it to Kenshin's main lieutenant, a severe man named Ito, and left without a word. Ito brought the box into the dining room where Kenshin was waiting for his meal. He placed it on the table. Kenshin stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a single, perfect white orchid. Its stem had been snapped in two. Naomi, standing in the doorway with their plates, saw the change in him immediately. It was like watching a placid lake freeze over in an instant. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. A stillness descended on Kenshin, so absolute it was more terrifying than any shout. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently. His hands, resting on the table, curled into fists. He did not touch the box. He did not touch the flower. Sato, he breathed, the name a curse. Ito nodded grimly. A message. It is a declaration, Kenshin corrected, his voice dangerously soft. He finally looked up, and his eyes met Naomi's. For a split second, she saw something in them beyond the cold fury. A flash of something raw, something that looked like pain. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind a mask of ice. Serve the dinner, he ordered, his voice flat. That night, the silence was different. It was no longer just awkward. It was serrated, filled with the unspoken threat of the broken flower. The danger she had only sensed before was now sitting at the table with them. A week later, she found her chance to leave. One of the cleaning staff, an older woman with kind eyes, took pity on her. You are too young to be in a place like this, she whispered to Naomi in the hallway, pressing a folded piece of paper into her hand. This is the bus schedule from the stop 2 blocks away. It leaves every hour. It will take you to Shinjuku Station. From there, you can go anywhere. Naomi stared at the schedule in her room that night. It felt like a passport. Freedom. She could pack her small bag, walk out the back gate, and disappear. Kenshin would be angry, but he would find another cook. She would be just another ghost who had passed through his house. She clutched the paper in her hand, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She decided she would leave before dawn. But that night, Kenshin came home late. She heard the front door open and close, followed by the low murmur of voices. She stayed in her room, her bag half-packed at the foot of her bed. Then, she heard a crash from the main living area. A heavy, sickening thud. Against her better judgment, she crept out of her room. Peeking around the corner, she saw him. He was alone. Ito and his other men were gone. Kenshin was slumped against the wall, a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt. A shard of a broken vase lay on the floor beside him. He was breathing heavily, his head bowed. As she watched, he slid down the wall, leaving a smear of blood on the pale silk wallpaper. He sat on the floor, his injured arm cradled against his chest. He was hurt. He was alone. The bus schedule in her pocket felt like a betrayal. She didn't think. She acted. She went back to her room, not for her bag, but for the small first aid kit she kept in her drawer. It was a habit from years of kitchen work. Burns and cuts were a daily reality. Returning to the living room, she knelt in front of him. He looked up, his eyes unfocused for a second before they sharpened on her face. Surprise flickered in their dark depths. You should not be here, he rasped, his voice tight with pain. You're bleeding, she stated simply, opening the kit. He watched her, his expression unreadable, as she took out antiseptic wipes and a roll of gauze. Leave it, it was an order, but it lacked his usual force. Naomi ignored him. She gently took his arm. He flinched but didn't pull away. His skin was hot to the touch. With a pair of scissors from the kit, she carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. It was a deep gash on his forearm, long and clean, but bleeding profusely. A knife wound. "Hold this," she commanded softly, pressing a wad of gauze against the cut. His eyes widened slightly at her tone, but he obeyed, his uninjured hand covering hers, pressing down. His touch sent a jolt through her. His fingers were long and cool against her skin. Their proximity was dizzying. She could smell the cedar and smoke of his cologne, now mingled with the sharp, metallic scent of his blood. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the tremor deep inside her. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm. He never took his eyes off her face. As she wrapped a clean bandage around his arm, her fingers brushed against the ink on his wrist. A dragon's body, coiling in intricate black and gray scales. It felt like touching something ancient and dangerous. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of her work, his ragged breathing, and 1,000 unspoken things. She had seen him bleed. She had touched his skin. She had disobeyed a direct order, and he had allowed it. When she was done, she secured the bandage and her hands lingered on his arm for a heartbeat too long. She made the mistake of looking up, and her breath hitched. His face was inches from hers. His dark eyes were fixed on her, no longer cold and distant, but burning with an intensity that stripped the air from her lungs. In that moment, he was not the master of the house, and she was not the cook. They were just a man and a woman, alone in the dead of night, surrounded by a danger that had finally drawn blood. He let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The charged space between them said it all. Naomi slowly pulled her hands back. She had made her choice. The bus schedule was still in her pocket, but it felt a world away now. She had stayed. She had helped him. And in doing so, she had tied herself to him with a thread far stronger than any employment contract. The aftermath of that night settled into a new, more dangerous tension. Kenshin's arm healed, but the wound between them remained open. The silent dinners continued, but now the silence was heavier, charged with the memory of her hands on his skin. He watched her with a possessiveness that was no longer subtle. She felt his eyes on her even when she was in the kitchen, a constant, unnerving presence. Ito, Kenshin's lieutenant, cornered her in the garden one afternoon. His face was a mask of polite disapproval. "The master has taken an interest in you," he said, his voice low. "This is unwise. For you." "I'm just his cook," Naomi replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Ito's lips thinned. "He has a history of complications." The last woman who became a complication for him was his sister, Emi. Sato used her to try and control him. She died because Kenshin could not protect her from his world. He let the words hang in the air, a clear and brutal warning. He carries that failure every day. Do not become his next 1 inch. The story settled like a stone in her gut. This was his wound. The vulnerability she had only glimpsed was a vast, cavernous grief. It should have made her run. Instead, it planted a strange, protective anger in her heart. The war with Sato escalated. 2 of Kenshin's cars were firebombed. A shipment was intercepted. The house, once a silent sanctuary, was now filled with the constant, quiet presence of more guards. Naomi learned to sleep through the sound of men checking locks and whispering into earpieces outside her door. The attack, when it came, was not subtle. It was a declaration of total war. It happened just after dusk. Naomi was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on dinner. Kenshin was in his study. Suddenly, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass ripped through the house. Gunshots followed, loud and concussive. Before Naomi could even process the noise, Kenshin was there. He moved faster than she could have imagined, a blur of dark motion. He grabbed her, his grip iron on her arm, and shoved her behind him. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He pulled a sleek, black pistol from a holster she never knew he wore. He moved like the room owed him space, using the large steel island as cover. More of his men appeared, returning fire. The kitchen became a war zone. Bullets ricocheted off steel surfaces with angry whines. The air filled with the smell of cordite and fear. Kenshin shielded her with his body, firing with a calm, lethal precision that was terrifying to behold. For a heart-stopping moment, he stumbled, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. A dark stain blossomed on his shoulder. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. The fear that seized her was not for herself. It was for him. In that instant, she knew Ito's warning had come too late. The firefight was chaotic, a symphony of violence. One of Sato's men, wild-eyed and desperate, broke through their line and charged into the kitchen. Kenshin was occupied, pinned down by fire from the dining room. The man saw Naomi huddled behind the island. He grinned, a predator spotting easy prey, and lunged for her, a knife flashing in his hand. There was no time to scream, no time to think. Her survival instinct, honed in kitchens and on dark city streets, took over. Her eyes landed on the heavy, cast-iron skillet she'd been using, still sitting on the stove. She didn't hesitate. She didn't wait to be rescued. She grabbed the skillet, its weight familiar and solid in her hands. As the man reached for her, she swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The pan connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He grunted, his eyes rolling back, and crumpled to the floor in a heap. Naomi stood over him, panting, the heavy skillet still clutched in her hands. Her knuckles were white. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross. She had met the violence of his world with her own. The remaining intruders were dispatched quickly after that. Silence descended once more, thick with the aftermath of battle. The kitchen was a ruin of shattered glass and bullet holes. Kenshin's men began to secure the perimeter, their movements swift and professional. Kenshin came to her. He ignored the body on the floor, ignored the wound on his shoulder. He stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her for injuries. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. His touch was a brand. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, unable to speak. His eyes, dark and intense, searched hers. What he saw there, she didn't know. Respect? Surprise? Possession? "You are a complication I did not plan for," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was not a declaration of love. It was something more dangerous, more honest. It was an admission of her power over him, the one thing he could not control. Naomi found her voice, the words tasting of truth and gunpowder. "I told myself I stayed because I had no choice," she whispered, her eyes locked with his. "I was lying." That was their confession. A shared truth in a room that smelled of death. A bond forged in violence. Sato had failed to kill Kenshin, so he changed tactics. He decided to unmake him. He went after his complication. The next morning, Naomi found a small, white box on the windowsill of her room, which overlooked the garden. Her heart seized. It looked chillingly similar to the one that had held the broken orchid. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside, on a bed of black silk, was a single, dead sparrow. And underneath it, a photograph. It was of her, taken a week ago, walking to the local market. She was circled in red ink. The message was unmistakable. The threat was no longer general. It was personal. It was for her. Kenshin's world had not just touched her, it had wrapped its tendrils around her, and now it was trying to drag her down. She was no longer a witness to the war. She was the battlefield.